All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. It is Monday, January 13th, 2025. The time is 5:02 p.m. and I'm gonna call to order the City of Burlington Board of Finance. And our first item is the agenda. Is there a motion on the agenda?
I move to adopt the agenda.
Moved by Councilor Barlow, seconded by Councilor Carpenter. Is there any discussion on the agenda before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. On to item number 2, our public forum. It is the practice of the Board of Finance to first go to members of the public in the room to see if there's anyone who would like to address the Board of Finance, and then we will go online. Is anyone in the room looking to address the Board of Finance? Okay, seeing none, we'll go online. I see former City Councilor Sharon Busher is online. Good evening, Sharon. You are ready? Yep, ready to go.
Yes, thank you so much, Mayor. I want to speak to a couple of things on the agenda. First of all, I want to thank you, your administration, and Catherine Shad and all the financial people for, I think, presenting very clearly the budget scenario that we face. And so I really appreciate that. You can interpret it as a resident, and there are, potential explorations. And anyways, I just want to say that it is very helpful. I do want to ask you as mayor, when you're making the statement, there will be no new taxes. Thank you very much. But as you point out, you will be calling up the public safety, the penny on public safety, and the one on parks. I'm not quite sure what that is, but that you don't have to, I'll do my own research on that. But I think that's important for people to know that those will be called up, and you point that out. But I think when you state things, there'll be no new taxes, but you will be utilizing taxing authority you are already granted. So that's just my take on that. Since I'm on the budget, because I wanted to say that I'm glad you have directed people to look at non-essential services and do a study and explore really who that service is provided to, etc., and where maybe some of these services can be eliminated because there's redundancy. So thank you so much for that. I have longed to have that done in a more comprehensive way, just to know. I don't know if there's savings, but I think it's important for us to know how we're spending our money. I do want to say that as someone on the outside looking in, I am a little concerned about the potential to expedite department mergers, just because I think that likewise needs more of a thorough process. That's just my 2 cents on it. No pun intended, adding money to a budget discussion, but anyways. And the last thing I wanted to speak about, which once again has to do with money, is the item on your agenda regarding DPW's request for the loan for the recycling, purchasing 201 Flynn Avenue, which I wholeheartedly support. I am a little concerned about the source of the city money, which is coming from the balance of DPW water resources. And because of the focus on the need for additional monies, I guess I need to better understand how we can I understand there's a fund balance of $234,000 that's available, but it is concerning to me to see that as the source. So I just wanted to point that out to you. And then the last thing, Mayor and Board of Finance, is that I tried to educate myself on the impact fee work session, and maybe I'm missing it, but it seems to be to me that what you're recommending is impact fees for water and wastewater, which is yay. They've been left out, and I'm not sure how that happened in the past, but that's so important. But I don't see in your proposed the impact fees for schools and libraries and and public safety, police and fire, and parks. So I think I'm missing something in this presentation. So I'm going to listen carefully and try to educate myself. But I wanted to point out to you that I couldn't understand the materials fully, and just wanted to highlight that. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sharon. Is there anyone else online who'd like to address the Board of Finance in public forum online? Seeing none. And no one else has come in from the public in person, from what I can tell. So we're going to close public forum and move on to item number 3, our consent agenda. Is there a motion on the consent agenda?
To adopt the consent agenda and take the action.
Thank you. Councilor Barlow moves the consent agenda, seconded by Councilor Carpenter. Thank you. Any discussion on the consent agenda before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Nay. Motion carries unanimously. All right, moving right along to our deliberative agenda, item 4.1 is with the Department of Public Works. It's an authorization for interfund loan from the Department of Public Works. So we have our team here. Would you like to kick us off on this item? Full team.
Yes, indeed. Really appreciate the opportunity and great to have such a team with me today. This really has been a team effort. So to recap why we are seeking to purchase 201 Flint Avenue. 1, to unite our soil management capabilities by having one modern and permitted facility. Currently, we have 2 facilities that are suboptimal. 2 is to free up space at 339 Pine Street for CSWD to expand their drop-off center to the public. And 3, so that we can tie up a 2-decade-long discussion between CSWD and the city and fully utilize over $100,000 of option payments that the city has already made to purchase this property. And I'll turn it over to Brad to talk a little bit about why we're approaching the interfund loan.
Yeah, so on September 23rd, Board of Finance and City Council approved the purchase and sales agreement for the property for the purposes as Chapin laid out. And my team set to work to develop a financing strategy for the property. We looked first to our kind of standard banking options, and the way in which that worked out was we had 2 available leases we could attach the purchase of this property to. It's called a ground lease is the mechanism by which we would do that. The one bank, JP Morgan, was not interested, and mostly for their own internal reasons, in that they don't fully have that financing mechanism up and running internally. The other was through KeyBank, and we got most of the way through that negotiation, but it stalled. They cited environmental concerns because of the way in which we were going to use the property for soil management. We then turned to our city policy for interfund loan, which is listed on the clerk treasurer's website for any reference, and negotiated with the airport, who fully vetted everything through their own internal legal team, in addition to the legal team of the FAA. They had the available fund balance and were amenable to the repayment terms from DPW, which under our interfund loan policy stipulate that these are for short-term loans, typically 2 years. This one's 3 years. We're asking for a grace period of 3 years while we use the solid waste generation tax to generate the revenue to fully pay. It is possible and perhaps even likely that we'll have this fully repaid in 2 years. And the agreement between DPW and airport allows for early repayment of the loan, which is in total $520,000. at an interest of 4%, which is equal to the Northfield Savings Bank 9-month CD rate as an opportunity cost for other funds in the city to help facilitate the interfund. So those repayment terms are all in agreement between all of the parties and with our city policies and our FAA partners. So now we're here, ready to move forward with financing. Should be resolutions attached. Yes.
Thank you. That's what it's- have to.
I think Brad covered a lot of the airport side of it. I think there's a major vetting process, and I shared some of that as well, specifically pertaining to the revenue use policy within the FAA. I'm also here with Murray Friedman, who between the airport team, we're able to confirm that this is an allowable use of airport revenue as long as we hit those interest rates, prevailing interest rates. So we're happy to be sitting in front of the board and later council to collaborate on another city effort. And we're in a position to do so.
Yeah, financially for the city, I think it's a win-win in that the interest payments will be retained within our city organizations as opposed to $20,000 give or take going to an external institution outside of our city finances.
Can we answer the Sharon question? Is that really up to the team?
So let's see where the questions are, how these questions come up.
Questions from the board? Councilor Barlow?
Thank you. Yeah, and I had reached out to CEO Shad and I talked with Director Longo this afternoon about my concern around what is allowable by the FAA. And so in your vetting through the FAA, what was that process? Did you just make a phone call? Do you have anything in writing? Or like, what's your level of confidence that this will not come back on us? Because related to what had been shared with me another time about a situation where the city and the airport got into trouble.
Yeah, which was a very real situation where there was a misuse of airport revenue, not in terms of a loan, but the misuse of revenue was allocated towards another department without an agreement and without interest. So the attorney does have in writing very specific language associated with revenue use policy, which is 5190. I lost it, but a very specific revenue use policy, all available online as well. And he wrote a legal opinion so to confirm that one, we're not just using revenue without following those specific guidelines, and two, that there is benefit to the airport. There is interest associated with it at prevailing bank rates, as well as a short-term time period to pay this back. So with that legal counsel's review, I think, I know that we're in a compliance position to go this forward.
That was my major concern. I'm super supportive of the project and the acquisition of the property. So I'm glad we could find a way to do that in the city.
Any other questions or comments from the board? Just a second. We'll follow up with folks who have questions from the public as necessary. All right, well, with that, is there a motion you'd like us to consider? It's a short one on the agenda.
So I made that stand up shoot and make the motion.
I can do
Councilor
this.
Carpenter's ready.
I would move to recommend that the city council approve the attached resolution.
Thank you, Councilor Carpenter. If there's, all right, seconded by Councilor Barlow. Is there any further discussion before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, team. Appreciate it. Jamie doesn't get to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, gonna move on to item 4.2, which is the distribution and collection system improvements, contractor budget amendment, the water resource division of public works. So reset team, take it away.
Okay, I'm gonna kick it off to our two team members here. Engineering Manager Martin Lee, watch it.
Sure, so we are at the end of four-year distribution building improvements project. This project was citywide. We replaced and relined water mains, replaced and relined sewer mains, and relined many stormwater pipes. The project is now at the end. We finished in October. As we wrapped up the project, we have the budget shortfall that I outlined in here, which is for this $8 million project. In order to make the project whole and get our final pay request, we're requesting $52,000, approximately $52,000 for water budget increase, $49,000 for the sewer, and $109,000 for the stormwater budget. These are three of the many budgets that were part of this project, and the total additional budget to make the project whole, the total increase would be $211,068. And so some of the reasons for the overages include the work this year, where there were a lot of unexpected issues on Green Street. We had a major water main break, and it involved having to pave a lot more of the road, as well as replace a lot more of the sewer main. I mean, we did, so the benefit there is that we got more sewer main replaced and more paving accomplished, but we didn't really have a choice after the water main broke. So that's really the sewer and storm budget, and why that piece went over beyond what we were estimating originally. And then on Ledge Road, the water main relining project had a lot more kind of ledge, and we basically we had more. It's ledge road, and we ran into more ledge than expected, which means there were more bends, because you can reline through a lot of straight pipe. We had more bends, and so we had to dig more pits, which resulted in the overage that we're presenting here tonight. In a nutshell, that's it.
Ready to take your questions?
Questions on this budget adjustment? Quiet group, except Councilor Barlow.
I just had one question, and I'm sorry I didn't send it ahead of time, but I didn't think of it till just now. Even with this overage, the relining operation is still way cheaper than.
It's
Relining, it's less cheap than it was a long time ago, right?
Yeah,
The
so-
costs of relining have started to catch up.
Yeah, it's not a black and white answer, because it's great on a place like Ledge Road where we're not going to blast a new trench. But if we can install a new water main on maybe a more residential, or maybe even some places in the city, like on Main Street, because we get more of a complete install, and the useful life of a replaced water main is greater than a relined water main. So relining has been great in many applications, like Ledge Road, other places with conflicts like under railroads. So we see a lot of benefit, but it's not our only tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, we're applying that tool versus open dig a little bit differently than maybe before, where we just thought we could reline thing. Because the cost, I think with the liner costs, we have talked about costs, some of the per linear foot costs also.
Yeah, that's right. And so that was part of this also, was that from the time when the project was initially bid, there were major increases in the lining product, the epoxy, and as well as fuel charges. So since it was bid, like right after the pandemic, inflation came on, have the inflationary cost increase as well, which is part of this.
Other questions? Discussion? Would you like to make a motion? And
Sure, I would.
this one, you can even shorthand our,
Oh, really?
well, for you, yes, this one.
I will, make the motion as
Counselor Barlow, and there are two actions, just to make a note, there's two different actions, that motion indicates. Thank you. Is there a second to Counselor Barlow's motion? Counselor Carpenter, seconds, thank you. Any further discussion before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Any opposed, nay? Motion carries unanimously. BW. All right,
Thank you.
moving right along, to item number 5, which is a fiscal year 26 general fund budget update from our CAO, Catherine Chad. All right, so Catherine.
Great. We have spoken a little bit about the FY 26 general fund budget, but not in a lot of great detail. And so this is really our first time to be able to do that. We also have this on the agenda for the full city council. But I think it's important for us as the Board of Finance to be able to have some time in depth to review this. Change the slide, okay. Specifically, the goals for our time today, as I mentioned, this is an initial overview. It is January, as you know, we don't pass a budget until June 30th, so there's plenty of things that will change. But in advance of town meeting day, we realize it's also very important to let residents know what to expect on their municipal property tax bill. And we want to offer clarity on whether or not we will seek a general city property tax increase in the upcoming ballot. Some context as we start this conversation. You may recall around this time last year, we were predicting about a $9 million budget gap. And although that budget gap grew over time, we were successfully able to close it without a general city tax increase. You can also see on this slide that we are reducing our use of one-time funds. That's all of our one-time funds, regardless of where that comes from. Some of that's ARPA money, some of that is our own use of fund balance. But we, like many municipalities, did come to rely on some of that ARPA money during the COVID crisis. And so now we are weaning ourselves off of it to make sure we have a very sustainable budget that doesn't rely on that. We are following other best practices, and as this body knows, we are reviewing our budget to actual reports on a monthly basis. And then quarterly, we've ensured that we're having plenty of time to discuss those. And all of this contributes to a more sustainable kind of longer term strategies. And we want that so that not only is budgeting easier for all of us, it really provides more predictable information to taxpayers so they know what to expect. Again, I want to just make sure everyone knows we're just talking about the general fund budget in this presentation. As I mentioned, we had $3.5 million of one-time revenues used in last year's budget. So we either need to replace those or reduce the expenses. Another assumption in this budget is that we're keeping the gross receipt rates level. The instructions that we gave to all department heads, and I see we have some in the room, so they can certainly confirm this, is we asked department heads to level fund their budgets. And I want to make sure that all city councilors and anyone from the public understands that if a department level funds their budget, that is really a reduction. That is at least a 4% reduction, because those departments are required to provide COLA, a cost of living adjustment. And we also provide what are known as step increases to our employees. So for most of our employees, that equals about a 4.2% increase, because we have we've negotiated a 3% COLA for employees who are in AFSCME or are non-union employees, and our step increases average of 1.2%. One caveat here is that while we asked every department, including police and fire, to hold their budgets level, it became quickly apparent that police and fire would not be able to do that without cutting staff. So in order to keep safe staffing levels, their department budgets actually increased. That was also compounded by the second bullet here. Of the $3.5 million of one-time costs, 2.4 million of them were ARPA funds, and those were used equally 50-50 in police and fire. And there's not a reasonable way for police and fire to make up that revenue. So it's important for everyone to understand those departments have undergone equal scrutiny of their expenses, the same as non-public safety departments. But we have strategically made the decision that those budgets will need to increase. Some of the other assumptions are no new projects or initiatives were included, and we are prioritizing affordability for taxpayers. Some of the drivers of the budget, we've talked about this $3.5 million. Our health insurance costs are expected to rise approximately 11%. And the fire and police budgets comprise about 40% of our general fund budget. As you may know, the police and fire contracts are up for negotiation as of this year. So that means we do not have a cost of living adjustment negotiated for fire or police for next year. So right now, I won't say we don't have any idea, but we don't have that negotiated. So in most years, when we go to work on the budget, it's very easy because we know we've negotiated 2%, 3%, 5%, whatever it is, and we just add that to the budget. In years where we don't have that negotiated, it is much more art than science. So we have come up with our best estimate, but since that these departments represent 40% of the budget, you need to understand that there's a lot more in flux than there is in years when we are not negotiating. These are some caveats. You know, I have mentioned a few times, we do expect these numbers to shift. We're very early on in the process. Again, we're making informed estimates, especially without a contract for police and fire. And we are a self-insured entity. Our health insurance costs are about $18 million a year, so that is significant. But those numbers of what the increase will be can't really be locked in this early. The numbers fluctuate based on how much our employees and their families actually use the plan. And since we are actually less than 50% of the way through this current fiscal year, there could be some adjustment to that 11% I talked to you about. Let's go into a little bit more in depth on the expenses. Overall, we are projecting an increase across all the general fund departments of between $5 and $6 million. That number will change, but that's what we have right now. Almost 90% of that is from fire and police. for the reasons that I talked about earlier. And the additional 11% is made up of small amounts in various other departments. And it's for one of two reasons, either to allow the public safety investments that started last year, and an example of that is increased, and the word should be security at the Fletcher Free Library, or for some small important one-time investments. And an example would be, we don't have a case management system in the city attorney's office. That's just a one-time cost, but it's also something that's important and is included right now in the budget. In addition to those costs, which all came from the departments, there are about $2 million of what we're calling additional costs. And I caveat this saying this number is even more variable than the previous one. Why is that? Mostly because a lot of what is made up in this $2 million are the FY26 expected health insurance costs, which I told you just a moment ago, don't have firm numbers on. And also, there is a small buffer of additional money for the negotiations for fire and police. We've made certain assumptions and put those into the budget, and because that's all the money we'll have in these negotiations, not just for cost of living adjustments, but for anything that the unions were to ask us for, there's a little bit of extra money in here. So as you can see, that's about $7.5 million of additional expenses. And lucky for us, there are some additional revenues as well. We expect about $3 million more of revenues in these areas in FY26 over FY25. The first one of these is the very last of the ARPA funds. I don't know at this exact moment how much that is, because this is really the quarters in the couch. This will be just all the tiny little amounts of money that are left after we've spent down everything that we've allocated our ARPA funds to. So it will certainly, I put this less than 300,000 here, just to give you some sense of the magnitude. Some of the other items on here, we talked about, we will employ the last 1 cent of the public safety tax that was approved by voters last year. We'll have some organic grand list growth. We also have another source of what I'm calling one-time funds. And that is, as we are retiring the debt service payments from the waterfront TIF. And in 2018, the previous CAO had put forward a plan that was went through the charter change process to eliminate the business personal property tax. And they timed that tax brings in about $1 million. So that when that went away, that revenue source would be replaced by the increase that the general fund would receive as the waterfront TIF debt service was being retired. So we would lose the $1 million from the business personal property tax, but we would gain $1 million from the TIF. In FY26, we have 1 year where we still have the business personal property tax, but we no longer have to pay anything on the waterfront TIF debt service. So that leaves us with 1 year where we have this extra $1 million. And because it's only 1 year, I qualify that as one-time money. But of course, we want to use it. And so when I talk about $1.3 million of one-time funds, it's the $300,000 from ARPA, excuse me, and this $1 million. So if we were to use all of that, that would leave us with approximately a $4.5 million gap. Pausing here for a moment to talk about the tax increase. We are not recommending a general city property tax rate increase. And as Sharon Busher mentioned, we are planning to utilize some of our existing capacity, so at this point, taxpayers should expect to see their municipal tax rate go up around 6 to 7%. And that comes from the additional 1 cent of the 3 cents approved for the public safety tax. It also comes from our dedicated taxes to fund GMT, our debt service, and our retirement tax will all be going up as they are allowed to by charter. That doesn't need to be voted on. And then lastly, one of our dedicated taxes is the parks tax, and it is different than the penny for parks tax. The penny for parks tax goes directly to capital needs, long-term needs for the parks. This parks tax can go to our everyday operating needs for parks. And the language in the charter is we will tax not less than 2 cents, but enough to pay for parks. And so we are proposing an additional 1 cent to help us pay for the parks. Some members of the Board of Finance have asked for a separate chart of all of our dedicated taxes and which ones are staying the same, which ones are going up, as well as a link to kind of how much, what is the maximum those rates could be, where is that found in the charter. I could not get that ready for tonight, but it's almost done, and you'll have that shortly, and I'll make sure that gets. A few additional considerations. These are all new items not talked about in previous slides, but many people will have heard us talk about our modern government initiative, and so we are expecting to save money or generate new revenue from some of those initiatives. We're planning to come back at our very next city council meeting on January 27th and give you a full update about what we have in mind here. But I'll say at this point, we're expecting somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million to come from those items. And that comes from some tweaking of the items and the timeline that we shared with you a few weeks ago. And that includes some of the department mergers that we spoke about, and really looking at what are the items that can have a noticeable impact on the FY26 budget and yet are still able to be implemented without, we've decided not to use the term low-hanging fruit because I don't think there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, but items that are realistic to implement in this time frame, and yet also save money. And then additionally, beyond that $1 to $1.5 million that will come and lay out those plans for you, we are also in the midst of working with many of our departments on what we're calling a service inventory. And big kudos to any department that offers services to the public, has been working on this, and many of them worked on it through the holidays. It details every service provided to the public, who specifically they provide it to, how frequently, under what authority, how much does it cost in terms of both sheer dollars and staff resources. And who else is providing the service, if there's anyone else who's able to provide that service. And we're working with those departments and with our union representatives to provide recommendations to the mayor about which are the non-essential services which could be cut in service of further reducing the budget. So that is very much in process. I reviewed the initial service inventories, a lot of really good information, and I went back with a few questions. And so that process is certainly continuing. Rounding the end here, the summary, no general fund tax increase. You're not asking for that on the town meeting day ballot. We are projecting overall a municipal tax increase of around 6 to 7%. We did have an 11% increase from FY '24 to FY '25, so it is significantly smaller. And there's lots of conversations and decisions, as you can see throughout this presentation, that still need to be had. A few next steps, we're continuing to work on the service inventory. Our department budgets continue to go undergo refinement, as well as the budget for benefits, especially health insurance. We continue to move forward on ModGov efficiencies, and as you all probably saw, the tax fairness working group is also set to begin later this month. And we will continue to update this body in particular. Now we're on to the fun part of questions and discussion. Anything you'd like to add, Mayor?
The only small thing I would add, Catherine, thorough ways, I really appreciate it, is just a little bit of context of where the service service inventory concept came from. As you might recall, we had a budget summit back in August with all of the department heads, a lot of division heads, people who touched budget work within each of the departments. And among many topics we talked about around policies we want to improve or draft for the first time, we explored a bit of the concept of equity-based budgeting. It is a practice for which you've heard the school district talk about, and it's something they've been doing for, I think, 2 or maybe even 3 years at this point. One of the resources that Catherine found for department heads to consider, everyone who was at that summit, spoke to the need to really understand what your core services are and do an inventory of sorts so that you're better able to understand what service you're providing for whom, but also then able to apply a better equity lens for understanding if you were to do budget cuts, be most impacted and why, and some of the more deeper themes for which this information will help the city, help us to really make sure that we are being very mindful if we are need to do any reduction of services. What is it? What is the justification for which, and making sure they're not having a disparate impact on certain portions of our community who would not be able to access that service in any other way, shape, or form, or at a much higher cost or whatever that might be. So this, I think, is a very helpful deeper dive in terms of each department doing this to better understand their services, and to just ask the question as of 2025, why are we offering this service? And to be able to have a very informed discussion rather than a blunt tool, which would just be a reduction by 2% or whatever that might be. So while I know this was a very big lift for department heads, I think this will be very helpful going forward, and hopefully we can continue to develop our muscle within departments and within the city leadership of understanding our budget even further. Okay, all right, so anything else, Catherine?
No.
Okay. All right, well, thank you again very much, and we'll open it up for questions or discussion from the Board of Finance, knowing we will also have a repeat show upstairs.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. It's helpful at this stage right around now that we be having this presentation, that we keep having these discussions through the end of the fiscal year. I did send a number of questions, Catherine. Thank you very much for giving me a number of those responses. I'm gonna ask you a question now, sorry, that was not on the list because it just came to mind. We will look forward to getting the detailed assessment of what the current rate of the different dedicated taxes are. I'm specifically curious where the authority is coming from to increase the dedicated parks tax. you mentioned some language around charter language that says that we shall appropriate at least 2 cents. But I don't think that has anything to do with taxation. I think that's requiring us to appropriate in our budget at least 2 cents in every grand list dollar to taxes, but distinguish that from some of the other sections in our charter that talks about the assessment of a tax, and in particular, we have the penny for parks tax, the theirs, and in addition to the chart, sort of where the authority comes from for each of the additional assessments. Follow-up question on another item here is I'm curious whether or not in the department's level funding, in absorbing COLA increases and other related expenses for next fiscal year, is that being realized solely through the elimination of vacancies? Or are there any departments proposing the elimination of positions held by current employees?
I will go back and do a double check just to be sure, because as you know, there's many, many departments. But Brad and I have reviewed all of them, and I believe that every department has found a way to achieve those cuts, and no one has suggested cuts to current staff.
Folks have offered budget neutral changes to the makeup of their position classifications, but none have offered reductions in staff or number of positions, but have found other ways to either increase revenues to the general fund or reductions of expenditures on the operating side of the budget.
Chapin, did you have, I saw you raise your hand.
Well, depending on policy directions that we go, the department will be bringing to the Board of Finance and the City Council concept of eliminating recycling. If we were to go ahead with that, there would be a reduction in our budget for FY26, but that's still to be discussed among the Board of Finance and Council.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Brad and others for that.
Actually, Councilor Chairperson, I was going to just add, because we just had a preparation meeting today for the tax fairness working group. I'll just start for a second, and we talked about Burlington's multiple splitter tax, for which a couple of these you addressed, and what the authority is behind that. There is inconsistency in our charter on what drives these splitter tax and the rules for which they are governed within our charter. And I will just note that I think for the sake of consistency and clarity for the public and for policymakers, that is one of the things we've discussed, possibly the group really looking into, because they're not consistent and they're hard to track around why the penny for parks splitter tax is different than the public safety tax, is different from debt service tax. So it is definitely something within the purview of that group. Just to make sure that the authority is clear, but that we're also being consistent and predictable about what we can pull from and what also requires voter approval versus not.
I agree. I appreciate that the tax fairness group will be taking that on. And I really appreciate your administration's commitment to getting us and the public additional information as to what these different dedicated taxes mean on property tax bill, because I do think that it will be important. I just think, this is the last I'll say on this, I think moving forward here as we continue to review the budget, so my commitment to affordability would be something less than a 7% municipal tax increase. I appreciate the attempt to level fund budgets. I appreciate that it is less than last year, but I firmly feel that we need to sort of break this endless cycle of 6%, 7% plus adjustments. We saw a presentation from the school district, for example, similar size budget. They're making tough, difficult, right-sized decisions where they're able to come forward with a budget that is, mistake me if I'm wrong, I think a 2.5% decrease from last year's budget. And I know that it's going to require really difficult, tough decisions on our part. But I think that those are the decisions that we need to make if we're truly committed to affordability here. So I appreciate the steps we've taken thus far, but from my perspective, I think we need to go even further. If we're going to address our commitment to affordability. And I'll just say one other thing on that front, which is that I'm concerned about our continuing to rely on gross receipts tax to that end. We received a presentation at our last meeting that I think calls into question the current state of those items. I'm concerned that we made a commitment to our local business community that part of that gross receipts tax would be sunsetted, and I'm left with the impression now that that may have not been the full intention at the time. And I think we owe it to our business community to follow through on that commitment. So I think there's more we need to do in terms of the budget and meeting our affordability concerns. And I don't think our gross receipts tax is the way to go about it. And I'll look forward to additional information with respect to some of the other dedicated taxes that have been collected in the presentation.
Thank you, Councilor Travis. I will reiterate what I said back several months ago when presenting fiscal year 25's budget to all of you, that as part of affordability, it's also about balancing our approach and making sure that the cost for whatever revenue we need to generate to maintain city services is not just on the backs of residents who live here. And that is why you were presented and unanimously supported, I hope, as part of the reason. Understanding that we have a balanced approach in order to make sure that we're committed to the safe staffing levels for police and fire, for which you heard, we're not able to ask them to level fund like we were, and they're 40%, almost 40% of the general fund budget. It was a very tricky balancing act to make sure that we are rebuilding in a responsible way the police department, while supporting the needs of our fire department with the acute public health needs we're having in our community. And to be able to balance, we need to make sure our tools are on the table and that we're working in partnership with our business community as well as the residents. And so this is the challenge of our time, to collectively and collaboratively work on this. And so we are presenting this to give you a kind of a little temperature read on where we are at, and we'll keep going deeper. Again, January 27th, you'll hear more about Modern Gov and some of the efficiencies and cost savings, which we're hoping. They're not the end all, though. They never have been, and I've been consistent about that, around where we can operate our government in a more lean way where possible without compromising core services. But then also getting to a place where getting to a place where we can make sure that we're coming off of this one-time funding cycle and right-sizing the government. It's not an overnight piece, and so there's a bit of transition of making sure we can raise the revenue needed to step ourselves into a more sustainable place. Did you have anything that you wanted to say? Okay. Other questions or comments from the board? Councilor Barlow?
Thank you, and thank you for the time you've spent on understanding this on Friday. One of the questions I guess I have is we still have a $4.5 million budget gap to close, and is the service inventory the tool that we think is going to need to be used to close that entirely, or do we think there'll be other things that we may discover or think of?
Great question. We have a $4.5 million gap, and then we are expecting approximately $1.5 million to come from some of the Modern Gov efficiencies we'll talk about on the 27th. So that leaves us with about $3 million. And I would expect that some combination of further Mod Gov efficiencies, the service inventory, and as we further refine the budgets, that number will hopefully go down. And so that's sort of the work of these next few months, but that's how we're thinking about it.
Other questions or comments? Knowing we have more time together upstairs. Very topic. Okay, if I can offer enough long pause, and
It brought to my attention that there's a discrepancy between the resolution, the motion and the resolution for the authorization for the interfund loan and what was the motion in the department memo. So can we go back on the record to rectify that with regard to item 4.1?
So on item 4.1, our motion that we made was,
And take 2 additional actions. Though those 2 additional actions were not captured. And if it's friendly to the Board of Finance, I'd welcome a motion and approval of what's in the memo so that we capture not only the resolution, but the 2 additional actions.
okay, so going track along here, so there is on Mr. Clerk, a memo that attached to item 4.1, just going backwards in time here.
Yeah.
And there are 2 additional action items at the end, I'm assuming here.
Yes, it's at the end of the memo.
Okay, I see. So there's 3 bullets. It's on page, it's not page.
Should have
Um,
put the pages.
let's see,
It's on the second to last page of the memo.
page 4. So page 4, under motions, Board of Finance, we have 2 additional motions. So procedurally, do we have to reconsider item 1 or take another?
Let's take another vote, have someone make a motion. And what if we just read all 3 bullet points into the record and then have the board vote on
We need to take a motion to reconsider item
Yes,
4.1 and then
let's
redo the motion.
this?
No one's making eye contact, so. Please make a motion to reconsider item 4.1. And the purpose would be for us to go back to the memo and make sure we make a 3-point motion to approve the item correctly. Okay, so Council Barlow is gonna make a motion to reconsider item 4.1 for which you've already passed. Is there a second for us to reconsider? Council Carpenter, thank you. Seconded it. Any further discussion on the motion to reconsider item 4.1? Okay, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Okay, so we're back on item 4.1 and we are going to see if anyone has a motion that is formed by the memo, which has 3 points. Does anyone have that memo up besides me? I'd like to make that motion. So far,
Waive the reading and adopt the resolution regarding a $520,000 interfund loan from the Patrick Leahy Burlington International Airport to finance purchase and fit up of 201 Flint Avenue, subject to the review and approval of the city attorney's office. And authorize an FY 25 budget amendment to use fund balance from water fund 460. Chief Administrative Officer and DPW Director to take such further actions and to execute such further instruments approved as to form by the city attorney as may be necessary or convenient to effectuate the transactions contemplated hereby.
thank you very much, Councilor Barlow. Is there a second on that longer motion that is now complete? So Travers, yes, is that your- okay. Any further discussion on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you for going back in time with me. We now are at the end of our agenda. Go around, any additional items? Okay, so we're at adjournment and seeing all the business at 6:02 PM, I adjourn the Board of Finance.